Welcome to the deep dive. You know, something that's landed on our radar, and I think it's really important for you to understand, is a new bill
Mm.
proposed in Congress.
hmm
It's called the Stop CCP VIAS Act. Sounds pretty direct, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And its aim is, well, quite fundamental. It wants to change how Chinese nationals can study here in the U.S.
Fundamentally is right.
Yeah.
So what are we actually talking about here?
We're talking about a proposal introduced by Republican Congressman Riley M. Moore back on March 16th. And it's not just tweaking things, it proposes a complete halt, a full stop to all student visas for Chinese citizens.
Wow. Okay, a total ban.
A total ban. Think about that.
Okay, so you're hearing that right, a full
Yeah.
stop. Now, for you, trying to understand why such a, well, drastic measure is even on the table,
Mhm.
what's the thinking behind it? Why essentially close the door?
Well, the core argument, as Congressman Moore and the bill's supporters frame it, really boils down to national security.
Okay,
They believe the current student visa program is being actively exploited by the Chinese government.
exploited how?
The concern is that it's basically a pathway for spying, for intellectual property theft, and just poses a wider threat to U.S. national security.
He was pretty blunt in his statements, wasn't he? I think I saw a quote, something about the number of students.
Yeah, he pointed out that nearly 300,000 Chinese nationals come here annually on these visas.
300,000. Wow.
And his take, pretty much verbatim, was that the U.S. has invited the CCP to spy, and it's time to, quote, turn off the spigot.
Turn off the spigot. That's strong language.
It is, and it shows the level of concern, at least in some political circles. It's also worth noting, for you to understand the context, he's not alone on this.
Right. Co-sponsors.
Exactly. 5 other Republicans have co-sponsored the bill in the House, so it signals a shared belief among these lawmakers that this kind of action is needed.
And they're not just saying this in a vacuum, right? They're pointing to actual examples.
Yeah.
The info we have mentions some recent cases, Michigan, Virginia.
That's correct. Proponents are citing several specific recent instances, cases in Michigan, Virginia, and Chicago, involving Chinese students who've either faced charges or been convicted for gathering sensitive information. Now, these cases are relatively few, but they're being used to argue there is a systemic problem, a vulnerability that needs this kind of really broad response.
Okay. But for you listening, it's vital to know this hasn't exactly been met with applause everywhere. There's pushback, right?
Oh, absolutely. Major pushback. The reaction from educators, from Asian American groups, from House Democrats, it was immediate and very critical.
What are they saying?
They're using words like xenophobic, disproportionate, and arguing it's based on, well, harmful racial profiling. These are serious criticisms, highlighting just how divisive this is.
And are they bringing data to counter the security argument? I think Sean Carver at UC Berkeley had something on this.
Yes, Sean Carver, who's the CEO of International House at Berkeley. And this is, I think, really interesting for you to consider. He shared a statistic that kind of reframes the whole risk assessment.
Okay, what was it?
He pointed out that in the past year, the number of Chinese students actually implicated in espionage activities was, wait for it, 0.017%.
0.0017%.
Exactly. It's a tiny fraction. Less than 2 students out of every 100,000.
Wow.
So when you see that number, a blanket ban affecting everyone suddenly seems, wow, like a very blunt instrument for a very, very small problem, doesn't it?
It really does raise that question of proportionality, doesn't it? Is this the right tool for the job? Which makes you wonder, are there other ways? Did Carver suggest alternative?
He did, yeah. He's advocating for a much more, targeted approach.
Like what?
Instead of a ban, focus on improving the visa screening we already do, maybe enhance it, target cyber espionage efforts more specifically, put extra safeguards around research in particularly sensitive fields, basically address the specific risks without cutting off everything.
Which brings us to another huge piece of this. The economics. International students contribute a lot, right?
A staggering amount. The figure we have is $50 billion contributed to the U.S. economy in 2023 alone.
50.
Billion. Billion with a B. It's a major economic driver for the U.S. And Chinese students are a big part of that, nearly a quarter of all new international student enrollments last year.
And Carver made a point about tuition, too, I think.
Yeah, he highlighted that Chinese students often pay higher tuition rates. And that money doesn't just disappear. It helps fund research, it supports cultural exchange, it boosts diversity on campuses.
So a ban like this,
Yeah.
It could really hurt universities' financial.
It could create significant funding challenges for many institutions, absolutely.
And beyond the money for schools, there's the impact on the students themselves and how they see the U.S. Eddie West at Cal State Fresno had thoughts on this.
Right, Eddie West. He brought up a really crucial point about perception. Just introducing a bill like this, even if it doesn't pass, it sends a message. He suggests it negatively affects how Chinese students and likely prospective students view the U.S. Is it welcoming? Is it hostile?
The whole soft power idea, right? Our influence through attraction.
Exactly. Framing China as an adversary in such a broad, exclusionary way with this kind of ban, it could seriously damage the U.S. image as a place for global talent and collaboration. Long-term consequences there.
And he drew a historical parallel too, didn't he? A pretty stark one.
He did. He compared it to the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Wow. That carries a lot of historical weight.
Definitely. He used that analogy to really emphasize how dangerous and, frankly, discriminatory this measure could be perceived. He called the Exclusion Act a shameful moment and warned this bill risks heading down a similar path. He termed it misguided at best and dangerous at worst.
So just to be absolutely crystal clear for everyone listening.
Yeah.
The scope of this proposed ban, it's not just certain fields, right?
No, not at all. This is critical to understand. The Stop CCP VIASS Act targets all types of student visas for all Chinese nationals.
All of them.
All of them. Which, as the sources point out, actually goes further than the Trump administration's proclamation back in 2020. That was more focused on specific graduate students and researchers linked to certain institutions. This is broader.
Much broader.
Yeah.
And there was another interesting comparison made, statistically. Ben Waxman from INTED.
Yes, Ben Waxman. He offered a really thought-provoking comparison to try and challenge the logic here.
What was it?
He looked at the percentage of Chinese students accused of any law violation, not just espionage, any violation. It was around 0.0003%.
Okay, still tiny.
Tiny. Then he compared that to the percentage of U.S. elected officials charged with felonies.
Oh, what was that number?
1%.
1% of elected officials charged with felonies versus 0.003% of students accused of any violation.
Right, and then he poses the question, does it make sense to dissolve Congress based on that 1% felony charge rate?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Point taken. It really underscores the potential disproportionality of targeting an entire group based on the actions of an extremely small fraction.
Exactly.
So if the U.S. did go down this road, make itself seem less welcoming, where would these students go?
Well, Eddie West predicts that places like the UK, countries in Europe, they'd likely become much more attractive options.
That makes sense.
So U.S. universities could lose out not just financially, but also on the talent, the perspectives, the connections these students bring.
Now, West also acknowledged something potentially uncomfortable, didn't he? That the system can be misused sometimes.
Yes, he did concede that point. He acknowledged that, unfortunately, there probably are some isolated cases where people misuse the student visa route, individuals who aren't genuinely here for academic reasons.
And that fuels the fire, perhaps?
He suggests that while these cases are likely rare, they can get amplified and sort of inadvertently feed into anti-immigrant sentiment, providing ammunition for broader crackdowns like this proposed ban.
But his point was, instead of a ban, maybe we could look at what other countries do.
Precisely. He pointed to the UK, for instance, where there's a system that puts more onus on the institutions themselves for compliance monitoring. And Australia has something called PRISMS, which apparently allows for real-time info sharing between schools and government agencies.
So more targeted, tech-based solutions, perhaps.
Suggesting there might be more sophisticated ways to manage risks without resorting to such a sweeping exclusion. Yeah.
It's also important to consider the view from China itself, right? The bill's proponents cite China's security laws. But what's the signal from Beijing on student exchange?
That's a really interesting counterpoint. While some U.S. politicians are focused on China's internal laws as a justification, the Chinese government itself has actually shown signs of, softening its policies towards U.S. students recently.
Oh, really? How so?
There are plans being discussed, apparently, to welcome something like 50,000 young Americans to study in China by 2030.
50,000, okay.
So it suggests a possible disconnect, doesn't it, between the security concerns being voiced here and the direction China seems to be taking on educational exchange, at least publicly.
What about the people actually dealing with students on the ground in China? Education agencies, advisors?
We heard from Ming Zisang, who's the director of BOSA, an education agency association. He really highlighted the uncertainty.
Yeah, I bet.
Even just introducing bills like this, he said, creates a lot of anxiety and uncertainty for students and their parents, regardless of whether the bill actually becomes law. It just muddies the waters.
So what's his advice?
Basically, seek out reliable information. Try not to get swept up in what he called transient political discussions.
Easier said than done sometimes, I imagine.
No doubt. But he did end on a more optimistic note, emphasizing that overall global student mobility, people wanting to study abroad, that's still a very powerful ongoing trend.
Right, despite political headwinds sometimes.
Exactly. He sees it as enduring, even if specific policies cause temporary bumps or shifts.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together for you, our listener. We've been diving into the Stop CCP VIS Act. It's a proposed U.S. bill aiming for a complete ban on student visas for Chinese nationals.
Driven by stated concerns over national security, espionage, and intellectual property theft.
But, as we've heard, it's facing really strong opposition. Critics are calling it xenophobic, disproportionate, potentially devastating economically for universities, and harmful to America's image.
And the data presented suggests the actual documented security risk from Chinese students, statistically speaking, is incredibly low fractions of a percent.
We've touched on alternatives, more targeted screening, better monitoring, learning from other countries perhaps.
Right, and the deep concerns about damaging international collaboration, the historical echoes of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and how this is perceived by students themselves.
We've tried, for you, to lay out these different viewpoints from the source material we looked at, keeping it balanced, not taking sides. Yeah. The goal is just to give you a clear picture of what's being proposed and debated.
Exactly, giving you the context to form your own understanding.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. When you consider all this, the security arguments, the huge economic factors, the value of international exchange, the diplomatic ripples, what do you think are the real long-term consequences? Both the ones intended by the bill's supporters and maybe more importantly, the unintended ones.
Yeah, what does this kind of sweeping policy do to global education, to diplomacy, especially in these tense geopolitical times? And maybe think about what role individuals, what role our institutions play in trying to foster understanding across borders, even when it's difficult.
Lots to think about there. Definitely a complex issue with no easy answers. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.